Hello, welcome to the Sideboard here at the Regional Championship, part of SGCon Charlotte. I'm Nick Miller alongside Pro Tour Lord of the Rings champion Jake Beardsley. How are we doing?
I'm doing good. I'm having a good time.
We are playing Mill today, and I want you to school us on Mill and what everyone is doing wrong and what you're doing right playing this deck.
Okay. So a big part of, do you want me to just give a overview of the deck? Okay, great. So some of the big pieces of the way that the Mill deck functions, you're almost a burn deck, but instead of targeting your opponent's life total, you're targeting their library. And while that means they start at essentially 53 life, you get to deal damage in much larger chunks. Archive Trap Mills for 13, which makes it closer to a Lava Axe for potentially 0 mana if they crack a fetch land. Tasha's Hideous Laughter can hit against something like an Underworld Breach deck that has a pretty low mana curve. It can mill as many as 20 or 25 cards, so that's 3 mana for 10 damage essentially, which is a lot. The Crab, Ruin Crab and Hedron Crab in conjunction with Fetch Lands and Field of Ruin help kind of are your goblin guides of sorts. But really the big reason that I decided to play this deck, at least from a competitive standpoint, I also just really think it's a lot of fun to play, is you get to main deck 4 copies of Surgical Extraction. And the vast majority of the modern metagame right now is built around decks that really care about specific cards. So the Big Boogeyman Underworld Breach combo, if you surgical their Underworld Breaches, it can become really tricky for them to win the game, especially when you're milling all of their other cards and they have a pretty finite number of things that can actually kill you. The Ketramos control deck, the new black-white blink version, they don't really clock you very well. And while Ketramos is really good against a traditional burn deck because it has lifelink, it's just a 4/4 against Mill because they can't really replenish the cards back in their deck.
Yeah, it seems like any deck that's named after a card, you like to have Surgical as a way to kind of disrupt what they're doing.
Yep.
And you play this deck almost like a control deck, as opposed to a burn deck in certain matchups.
Yeah. So against a lot of decks, you're just you're using your mill spells to find their key pieces so that you can cast a Surgical Extraction or an Extirpate to just get rid of them. And then it doesn't really matter what happens after that because so many decks are built around pretty key pieces. You do have a decent amount of interaction. You've got Fatal Pushes, you got Drowning the Lock, which is a nice counter spell or murder, a split card essentially. To go with an Ottawara and some Field of Ruins for a little bit of mana disruption, especially since you can mill a lot of if you mill the 1 or 2 basics most modern decks play, it just becomes a Wasteland or a Strip Mine.
Not to mention it has a nice synergy with the crabs, as you mentioned.
And it can force them to search, which turns on Archive Trap so you can play it for 0 mana.
Yeah. And is that the all-star of the deck? What would you kind of label as the real home run in this deck?
I would say it's Surgical Extraction. I don't think that, I think Mill is a very specific, meta call in this instance. Underworld Breach is 23-25% of the metagame. That deck is very vulnerable to lots of Surgical Extractions. The Ketramos deck is not all that vulnerable to Surgical Extraction, but they're just not very good into Mill. For instance, if this was a year ago, I would never even think to play this deck because you're not actually very good against decks that just play a creature, attack you, play another creature, attack you. This deck has a really hard time beating something like Rakdos Scam. I obviously was going to have to bring that up in this interview.
Yeah. And what about Energy is on the way down? Is that one of those decks you would kind of categorize as that?
Energy and Domain Zoo, I would say, are probably the 2 decks that I'm most afraid of for that reason. They just play a creature, attack you, play another creature, attack you. Energy is a little more manageable because sort of like with the Underworld Breach deck, they have a really low mana curve, so they can be pretty vulnerable to Tasha's Hideous Laughter. But mostly, I would like to dodge Boros and Domain Zoo and play against lots of Breach and Black White.
Take us through some of the tricks of the trade, something that a novice player wouldn't see when looking at this deck list.
Sure. So I think the biggest thing that a lot of people who play Mill don't do enough is mulligan. It feels bad to mulligan away, especially in an open deck list situation where you're playing against Underworld Breach, say. You should try your best to not keep hands that don't have a Surgical Extraction. The big problem is with the way that the card Underworld Breach works, if you mill them and then don't get rid of their key pieces, you're actually helping them because they just want to mill themselves and fill their graveyard and escape things with Underworld Breach. So with Hedron Crab, which can target either player, unless I have a Surgical Extraction, I will target myself with the Hedron Crab triggers just because I don't want to help them unless I have a way to interact with their graveyard.
Right. So you'll kind of hold that, wait till you can hit a big chunk, and then try to go from there.
A lot of the time, I won't even try to hit a big chunk
okay.
until I can start. I will just do everything I can to not mill them until I have a surgical extraction or an extirpate. Or sometimes I'm willing to lean on like a drown in the lock so that I can counter the Underworld Breach on its way down. But I try very hard not to mill a Breach opponent unless I can stop them from comboing in that time period.
Okay. And what else we got going on here? We have an Oboro hanging out, a Shelldock Isle, which is sweet.
Yeah, so your mana base is pretty robust. You're just a 2-color deck. You want to play a good number of fetch lands because they interact really favorably with Ruin Crab and Hedron Crab, but you've got some room for some fun ofs. Oboro is really good with those crabs because you can just tap it, pick it back up, replay it, make sure you've always got a stream of land drops to trigger landfall. Shelldock Isle, a lot of the time, helps find that last key piece, right? You get them low, and then you can cast whatever you hit away under the Shelldock Isle for that last 10, 15, whatever cards. The other nice thing about like Shelldock Isle is a lot of the time you don't want to play a crab on turn 1 before you can trigger its landfall ability, because you don't want to just, if I just go Island Crab go and like your Underworld Breach opponent just lightning bolts it or something, that's like you've wasted a very key card. So a lot of the time I'm pretty happy to play a Surveil land. I have 2 of those, or a Shelldock Isle on turn 1. And then on turn 2, I just play my crab and then play my fetch land to make sure I get some value out of it.
Right. Take us through the sideboard here. We have Consign to Memory like almost everyone in the tournament has. Yep. But you have a different reason for this card other than just counter a colorless card.
Yeah, so it's still very good against Eldrazi, and the Eldrazi matchup is close enough that you want to have that little bit of extra interaction, but one of the most important things you can do with it, and it doesn't come up a lot, but it really matters when it does, is you can counter an Emrakul the Eon's Torn Shuffle trigger that, right, if you mill it over, then they get to reshuffle their whole graveyard, which just undoes everything you've done, but if you just Consign to Memory, counter the Emrakul trigger, then you just move on. And so a lot of time in post-board games, if I know they have an Emrakul, which is a big deal about this deck, is that I don't know that I would play this unless it was open deck lists. That knowing exactly what my opponent has what I want a surgical, what hands I want to keep, whether I need to put Consign to Memory under Shelldock Isle, is those sorts of things are really important.
Yeah, and we've seen on Twitter lately the deck list posting with Emrakuls in the sideboard, and everyone's like, yes, we have to come equipped.
Pay the mill tax
to beat this deck. And you have your own counterplay. Anything else to call out here in the sideboard of note?
I love Crypt Incursion. Crypt Incursion is awesome. It's mostly for your worst matchups. So that it's your Haymaker against Energy. Exile in testing the other day, I got to exile 15 creatures from my opponent's graveyard and gain 45 life. I won that game, as hard as that is to believe.
I believe it.
But so it's sort of it's not the best card, but it serves a very specific role and it plays it really, really well.
Yeah, and this is a deck that feels like that is what it's looking for. It's looking for super niche cards that come in the exact matchups you want, not so much these broad cards that answer everything.
And I think that just is true of Modern right now. So many decks are asking very specific questions and require very specific answers.
All right, anything to wrap up here or call out in specific?
I want to shout out my girlfriend for being the one to tell me it would be really funny if you played Mill. I was like, you're right, it would be really funny if I played Mill. And now I'm playing Mill and I'm 3-0, so hopefully we can keep that train rolling and get back to the PT. That'd be really sick.
Awesome, Jake. Well, thanks for joining me here in the sideboard.
Thanks so much.
Stay tuned to Star City Games all weekend long for the action here in Charlotte.